So previously, the video that I posted was trying to figure out what the resistance might be that we face from traditional cultures or communities when we try to branch out from something that's sort of formally understood to be a coherent way of practicing a faith-based tradition. Um, And this is where things start to look to scholars in these communities as somewhat heretical to maybe what they understand to be something that should be unchanged or should continue to have like an authoritative uh, way of existing in the world, building on something that is sort of retaining itself to be unchanged or um, true in its own absolute form. So, to, I mean, this in itself is an entire field of study. And it's in a postmodern world, it can sound like, oh my gosh, I feel like people will just, I can almost see people rolling their eyes and just almost wanting to walk away. And this is probably would be an accurate reaction of someone who's maybe new to wanting to understand religions or tradition and doesn't appreciate maybe why it looks the way it does today, um, with its following being as diverse as they are. So, what I mean by that is, um, 1400 years ago, there was just a collection of people after the prophet's passing that decided to preserve his way, right? So, they wrote all his sayings and all his actions, and that's called hadith narrations, which is basically his speech or his some of those contain his actions. So it's almost like to say, I've, if I was to go back in time, I could have been a companion who said, I lived with the Prophet for the last, I don't know, 40 years of his life before he died. And this is what I used to see. This is what I used to hear him say and do. And that is something that becomes corroborated by other companions. So it was almost like an occupation, and people would um, kind of travel to long distances and say, well, when delegations used to come from this area, what did you used to hear? And so it just became like a massive area of study. Um, these narrations are different from the actual scriptural revelation, and this is where it becomes really difficult to understand, like, okay, he's a human, but he's an inspired human. And like, how do you differentiate, like, okay, if his actions are uh, like a step above everybody else because he's already identified as a prophet, how are we to relate to his human life outside of what is inspired and what's almost preserved by God as this is going to be inspired and this is unique to you, but it's supposed to be applicable to all of humanity. So it's a conundrum of itself, and you kind of have to come to your own conclusions about how you want to integrate that in your mind and make it make sense. What worked for me is understanding that as the prophet, he would allow people of different vocations to not rely on him for advice. So, for example, if in agriculture, um, people would suggest, why don't you, they'd go to the prophet and say, you plant this. And although there is blessing in that, because it's almost like, you already have God's providential care. Can you do this for us? His response was no, like, you understand the worldly trade more than I do. So you have the priority to be able to continue to do this because the process for it. Whereas I'm an inspired being, so my knowledge in the world is basically limited to helping you understand how to return to kind of meaningful understanding of life. So it is almost like creating a spiritual complement to what the secular world, I can say, at the time would have been. It's not really secular yet. It's more just like a desert life. Um, So this, if I bring this kind of understanding to the present day, this is where I struggle with authority figures within religion, because sometimes if we find somebody who we resonate with, because their teachings are just something we want to adapt with and they make sense for us, sometimes we want to kind of give them a sort of absolute authority. Like we would just want to say, you know what, I just want to take your understanding of something and I want to apply all of it to my life. And I hesitate to suggest that this is healthy, um, mostly for the person that you're giving that much power to, because this kind of um, it this kind of attention or accolade, it actually isn't healthy for an individual, especially if they're on a spiritual path already, because we believe that our true nature is always inclining to true meaning and trying to find some kind of peace with itself. But because we're made of matter, there's also darkness within us. And in a world where the spotlight is almost revered and we want to have influence, a lot of the power that people give us, like as an audience, can get to our head in a very unhealthy way, where people start to assume of themselves as, you know, I do have the ultimate answer. And then, um, like I know in parts of Asia, there are people who are kind of ascribe to themselves as prophets, and you know, to each their own. They tend to be met with a lot of violence. So it's just kind of like, just be careful with how you decide to give authority and power to those that you are learning with. So just maintain that, you know, I do esteem this person because of the knowledge that they carry and how they're able to kind of provide a commentary that's relevant to our contemporary context. But bear in mind that they are also human, and their private life is meant to be human as yours or as anybody. So it's supposed to have a family that's going through conflict. It's supposed to have kids that are, you know, maybe antagonistic to what their parents' lives are and what their teachings are. So just keep that human element there. So if you were to kind of strip away their knowledge of God and spiritual life, they could just be like any average Joe. So that's, I think, important for everybody to kind of keep in mind. And that kind of brings us back to why I'm almost hesitant to explain that there's any one particular way of maybe going back into tradition, with a postmodern lens. So, 3 years ago, I used to work at a dollar store. This was around COVID. So everything was kind of, as we know, it was just shut down. And um, there just became kind of like a lack of newness with information and with how to understand reality. It was mostly just almost concern and this, how do we deal with reality right now when people are kind of stuck at home and they're with their families, so now they're trying to understand each other in a completely new lens. And I think that's where people started to really come up against a lot of different struggles. And in a way, it's good because it almost helped people understand that what are we almost relying on to help us through these struggles if we are not caught up in work life balance and we don't have the time to kind of sit back and try and understand some of the existential questions. um, I mean, we never really thought of it until now, maybe because we just never had the time to. So with that in mind, um, I think a postmodern lens became something that came into the fore, where things just started to get deconstructed and loss of authority became a thing. Like it was almost like, how do we, what do I decide to understand, and based on what, and who is, and from an understanding where a lot of people may have already written off religion as being something that's not really applicable to the postmodern world. It just looked to me like it was like approaching chaos or like anarchy. Like I couldn't understand how we all sort of coalesce into this one big blob, and it was difficult to differentiate anything from another. Maybe this is just relevant to my context in a kind of smaller city, but for me it was almost like I was having a really difficult time adjusting to any kind of rhetoric with anybody, because nothing made sense. Like nothing was coherent, nothing was able to build on itself from the previous day, and it was just like, I think I'm losing my mind. And so to know that you have tradition to go back to, more than just a few decades ago. So I'm thinking, if you go back 1400 years ago, that is the most recent revelatory context that we have, where like revelation was something that we believe existed, with a context in the desert. And I'm keeping this broad because I do want people to kind of approach this without the typical narrative that they're accustomed to. So I almost want you to have like just this really blank canvas, and then just just pinpoint a few of the things that I'm saying and try to connect the dots yourself. Um, so if we are to go back to that point of time where we know for sure that this studying revelation and scripture was done in a structured way, and it was almost an occupation for a majority of the people at the time, um, then we can feel grounded again. Like we can say, okay, well, we know that this text is building on something that we know existed 2000 years ago. So already we're identifying, okay, so we want to understand something about the Quran 1400 years ago, and then going back to Christ, so something around the Bible. And then if we keep going back, we've got the Torah, and then back further than that, we've got the Vedas, or the Hindu scriptures. So knowing that we can keep in mind that the source is one, and it's just different groups of people having different conflicts, and so different inspired people arriving and almost suggesting, or not really arriving, it's almost like within these communities, people arise and say, you've known me all this time, my perspective is different, and I'm approaching what your practices are as though maybe they're not helpful in continuing your existence as a community. And if we continue this way, we are going to become extinct. And that's basically what prophets are. Like they come as a sort of reform to the norm at the time, or the status quo, and as a way to kind of help people realign with greater meanings. So it's not to say that you have to write off everything you've been doing. It's just to suggest, try to understand why you're doing it, and if there's any wrongs that are being kind of instigated on other people, that's probably the reason why we're all struggling. So if we continue to see tradition from this postmodern lens, trying to understand, going back in time is kind of an art form. So it might mitigate some of the threat that traditional scholars might have with tradition kind of taking on a reformed lens. Um, so I don't know how to explain what heresy is. It's almost like to say, if I was a scholar of tradition and I'd see somebody who wants to suggest that I am a Muslim and this is what I'm doing, um, but the scholar has no way of relating to any of it, they would call that person a heretic. So that's where I would hesitate as myself as a scholar to say, how do we continue to allow this new way of thinking to exist without threatening people who want to maybe identify with the Muslim population, for example, or the Christian population. So with Christianity, it's probably easier because they've already gone through that process of enlightenment where you've got Protestantism being very, very, very diverse. Islam doesn't really have that as much. It's got different sects, but scholars rarely know how to, I think, identify and communicate with each other. It's almost like they've just subdivided, and then they won't even, I don't think, always legitimate each other. So it's very difficult with to see within a Muslim world. But and that's kind of, in a way, it can be just the beauty of diversity and how people and different countries or populations try to make sense of something that they want to believe can be timeless and remain true to the context of people trying to understand it and make it applicable to their life. So being myself now, someone who I still do want to identify with myself as a universalist, this is maybe where I would be a point of contention for scholars. So they'd say, like, you're basically encouraging heresy. And yeah, I mean, to an extent, it might look like that. But when I look at the like all the stories that are mentioned in the Quran with almost a way of God, as it were, commiserating with the prophet, like saying, meeting up with all of these resistant populations or groups of people who tend to be the nobility, so they're almost already the upper class, isn't something new. Like, if you look back in all the stories that are mentioned, or that God is saying, like, that I've kind of introduced to you, the narrative is always the same. It's always that there's this tradition that is a norm, and coming up against it is always met with resistance. And then you have violence, and then you have persecution, and then eventually, because it rings true and it resonates with um, people's idea of, I mean, you're not really asking for much other than that we have to realign with a certain ethic. And that does tend to disadvantage the upper class, depending on, you know, how they've let power influence the way they are in the world. So I don't really know what to say to that, because it's almost like I can't say that I am who I am right now without the existence of these scholars that I learned with or from, and be it like a seminary or just several YouTube videos, and kind of just do it yourself learning, or going to a public university and understanding the phenomenon of religion or sociology. um, it's not to say that I can negate any of that having been beneficial for me. So it's almost like I can't say that I'm a product of something and then tear it down, because it's almost like I'm like, this is the epitome of ingratitude. But to allow myself to say, um, thank you for allowing me this space to kind of be someone who's critiquing the way we've been, while embodying and kind of esteeming every aspect of education that we've had in the past and continue to want to work towards. um, we can try and create a safe space for people to try and wrap their head around, how applicable is this for me now? And even if I don't choose to identify with Islam or Muslims, like, how how threatening would it seem to a scholar that I want to study the Quran and maybe create an art out of it, for myself, or in some kind of film or theater industry. And it's going to be, at the end of the day, it is what it is, because people recognize, like, sometimes I'll watch movies or I'll watch YouTube videos where it's not necessarily from someone who would identify as Muslim, but it'll resonate with me on so many levels with everything I might have known or practiced from Islam. And I almost, part of me want to say, oh my gosh, like, you stole that. And that typically is the rhetoric. Like, why do we feel like we have a right to it because we identify as that way? um, but then if we actually go in and say, yeah, we are Muslim and we are identifying as this, we're met with, but you're not doing it the correct way. So then it's like, well, I can't win either way. Like, what am I? So it is perplexing. And it's I think, just because of the nature of the sequence of history right now and how we're evolving, it's just going to be something we're going to have to contend with. And thankfully, with communication and technology being what it is, um, we're allowed to kind of come together across cultures without necessarily clashing in any, like, physically violent way. It's mostly going to be rhetoric and understanding how to not lash back, and having those knee-jerk reactions where we just want to shut down someone who may not agree with the way we do things. So right now, if we are assuming, okay, a postmodern lens, and I'm going to assume this is an art form, so I'm studying literature now. I'm not going to go back to tradition and say this is a revelation, but I want to keep that in mind, in the back of my mind. So then it becomes, I have to keep in mind that I'm going back 1400 years ago to a desert scene. And this is a place where um, tribes are creating war because they want to reign supreme, with their idea of what God is, right? So that's basically what scholars are saying right now. Scholars say that this is a way of maintaining. Scholars would suggest that speaking about God is not something that's open for everybody, as it were, because they might assume that there's ways of blaspheming or just not having the right reverence for how we speak about God. And I agree. I definitely can relate to that experience, where sometimes people just, they say things about God and it's just like, man, like, But I've stepped back from that kind of reactionary response to saying, well, how are these people supposed to know any different? Like, from what they see of people who practice a faith and esteem God or say anything in the past, it's just been violence. It's difficult to see anything other than that when we're even met with that kind of response from like scholars. So it's like, I'm never given the freedom to think, really. So having that in mind, it's like, well, why am I not allowed to understand God in my own terms? And it's a good start, because then you can start to say, I'm going to go into nature and I'm just going to see what the universe tells me. And then from that, I want to maybe try to understand an authoritative view on how God is described. And this is usually what's called a creed. So it's almost listing a way of um, suggesting the steps that people have gone through in the past and understanding the nature of how to understand God. And the only way to do that is to go into scripture and see how God explains himself. So, I mean, you can take it for what it is. From an Islamic perspective, whenever I do try to think about God, I just think about the attributes. So, um, there are several attributes mentioned in the Quran that are within a context of certain verses. So, if God's talking about um, how to interact between genders, for example, um, God will give sort of like, here's kind of like a guideline, and then at the end it'll say, and God is always merciful with believers. So it's almost assuming that because you're trying to do your best with ethics and understanding that, there's boundaries I have to kind of respect. I'm not doing this haphazardly. So it's already assuming that God knows this is going to be a place of conflict, and we have kind of like grace if we try to do it with an intention of not really harming the other. Um, so I think this is where the conflict begins with God. It's almost to say, well, what is God suggesting? And my response is usually just an easy way to live. Like it's supposed to align with you. Like if you think of Taoism, it's supposed to be that effortless way of existing in the world. It's not supposed to be, well, because you don't think this way, we can exist together. Like how do I know that our contexts collapse entirely the same? So my existence and my history is very different than yours. Even if we're siblings, our order in kind of birth is already different. So naturally, we're going to have that difference to kind of contend with. So it allows that uniqueness to kind of evolve. Um, and I don't really know what to say more than that with regards to how in a current lens like 2023 we can continue to try to be antagonistic to people's understandings of God. Like if we just let it exist as, you know what, you believe in some kind of superior being, and just leave it at that. And it really doesn't have to be about an existence of, evolution, or we came from nothing. Like going into those topics can be fruitful just because it kind of um, it builds a sort of narrative in your mind that helps you think through certain conundrums, as it were. Like, why would God do this? Or like, how do I understand God? And from my own experience, going into those kind of questions about the nature of God, it's never going to be a good idea. Like your brain starts to just spin around these questions, and in the end it's not really fruitful. So it's better to just continue with the attributes, and then just think of, like, just for me, I always just assume space and light, so it's just blinding. Like you're not going to be able to see anything other than, if I scale back, then I'll be able to come back to the earth, or like to ground myself, and then just say, these descriptions help me understand something that my mind can't really grasp or comprehend. um, and just leave it at that. So why would understanding, um, if I was, yeah, to remain in the desert right now and say all these different tribes are trying to understand that my God has to remain as it is, your God should remain as it is, and why don't we just keep our diverse gods all together and worship all of them in the same way? Back then, uh, it was a problem, as it were, because it was um, it was a tribal existence. There was no common ground at all. So it was almost like, what your law is going to work for you, and I have no idea what I'm going to come up against when I come into your tribe. So it's almost like this is just the rule of a certain group of people, and then a certain group of people. And I mean, if I say I'm allowed to kill you, fine. If the other one says I'm allowed to steal from you, fine. And then it's just like, well, how is this in any way godly, and why? And so I think that's maybe where the problems kind of found themselves arising. Um, so I think I'm going to leave it at that, because to understand where we want to allow ourselves this kind of godly authority and say that because I'm inspired and it makes sense to me, therefore it should be what's ruling, is basically the downfall. So trying to remember that we have these scriptures that we evolved from, and we're supposed to kind of grapple with it, but to kind of come to a collective um, understanding is where we want to kind of maintain democracy and like the majority of what's maybe accepted as maybe this is what we want to work towards in the future. So it is kind of like a progressive way of thinking of how to be in the world with scripture without letting scripture being that kind of governance. Because I mean, anybody could, you can have a group of 10 people all studying the same verse at the same time, and all 10 will walk away and say, no, this is the correct way. So I mean, try to drive a ruling or like some kind of law, it's not going to work. It's just, this is for your personal life to kind of reflect on, and then secular law remains as it is, like just treat each other well, and I mean, you're free to practice whatever it is. So that is basically what I think we're all struggling with right now, is the freedom of consciousness, the the freedom to defend our freedom of thinking about our reality without feeling threatened. And if we go back in time, that's basically all it's ever been. That's why, and it's integral to keep that in mind, because with AI and advanced technology kind of being something we're working with right now, it's to a large degree able to look alluring to just anyone who says, I want to withhold my intellectual integrity and just go with AI. So I mean, you're basically suspending your own idea of being able to think critically with anything and just submit to a robot that's man-made and that can override your brain in maybe unhealthy ways. So if you keep that in mind from the Hindu scriptures till present day, just know that every single prophet that came was there to defend freedom of consciousness, and that we have the right to find meaning in ourselves about how the universe works and how to build an ethic with that. And that's it. Not necessarily needing to build wars anymore, because we are able to kind of build rhetoric and argue for diversity now. And yeah, it's a hopeful, it's almost like a hopeful starting place, because we don't really need to just revisit 20 years ago where it was just wars and fear of the other and almost assuming that one way of thinking about the universe is going to override another. They do really complement each other. So we'll leave it at that for today.